Hi, Jeff. Good to see you.
You too, Angus. A
Really good
pleasure
to
as
see you.
always.
Yeah, for
I
me
can't
as
wait
well.
to dive into this chapter. It's an absolutely amazing piece of work, and I'm seeing it in so many new lights.
It just keeps getting deeper and deeper, doesn't it? In
Mm-hmm.
positive ways. Hopefully, Jonathan will be joining us in a little bit, but we'll kick off now.
Okay, sounds good.
So I've just done a very brief resume of where we're going to be going with this, which is basically the same structure as the chapter itself, chapter three. We look at his Billiards examples, the importance of observation thinking, understanding the relationship. He brings in this picture of Genesis, which I think is really interesting as to why he does it in relationship to what thinking is, or the nature of thinking, perhaps. We have a discussion about Descartes, which was interesting for certain group members, and raises some interesting questions, as we were talking about just before we went on, before we started recording, that how we come to this book, the type of mental preparation is going to have a big impact on how we read it and where we might hit roadblocks. Look at Schelling. I think I did quite a bit of reading around Schelling as I tried to understand a certain part, which we'll get into. Steiner uses the metaphor of Archimedes and his lever, and I think there's a lot of significance in there, which we can dig into a little bit. And then he finishes off with what seems like a random geology analogy, but again, once you scrape the surface, you realize perhaps there's something far more interesting going on beneath the surface. Anyway, let's see. So, got our first picture up, the billiard table. Tell us, what do you think is going on when Steiner starts talking to us about billiards? If you were re-describing it to somebody, what would be the main points you would describe?
Well, that's a good way to put it. Well, first of all, I note that it's a mechanical process, essentially, right? It's an inorganic process of the kind that is sometimes presumed in physics, say that all existence works this way. So I think he's taking the sort of proverbial bull by the horns as relates to history and philosophy of science in a certain way. Um, the idea that um, observation and thinking are separate acts in time and existentially separate, particularly as relates to um, mechanical processes or inorganic processes, and that the observation doesn't change the doesn't change anything about the events happening, and one can even choose to observe without adding any concepts to it at all, which is an interesting um, thing that I think we can come back to later as relates
Yeah.
to a what freedom is actually
And
to
it'll
some
be
extent.
very key in chapter four when we talk about the given,
Well, it also
perception.
it implicitly picks up the notion of choice and where choice is properly placed in relationship to the chain of events that occur in a free deed, say.
Yeah.
So he establishes the separate thinking and observation. He uses the billiard balls to do so. Uses then the way in which we add to the observation the thinking processes that that can um, allow for an understanding of what's going to happen or what has happened or what is happening even. And then he says, in order to prove the point about observation, he says that somebody steps in the way, say, and you don't see the events, and so you can't note what occurred, and so you can't mark the what happened. But if you had all the concepts as relates to uh, the uh, the actuality of the objects, their and the quantitative nature of the surface and velocity and yada yada yada, things that you could
Elasticity,
pop
momentum,
into a
blah, blah.
computer, for example, and you could do a computational download of all of the possibilities, and then narrow it into what's actually happening. So, um, uh, so then that leads to the idea that you could predict the outcome if you had all of the concepts available for that. And so that's a way to separate observation and thinking, and to show that thinking is absolutely added on to the process, but in no way says anything about the nature of thinking, and in a way says a little bit more about the nature of observation, but also not what later we'll talk about probably is the nature of observation when we're observing thinking, right? Of course, but in this case, it's the observation of a predictable outcome. Say, if you have the concepts predetermined concepts.
And this is like the big dream of Newtonian physics, isn't it? So like if I knew the position of every atom in the universe and I had to like all this like correct modeling, I could predict like the end of it's like all that's going to happen in the universe. I mean, okay, that's a worldview of 400 years ago, but it does represent. It's like it's an analogy to the billiard table here, isn't it? So like if I know the positions of the atoms, then I can predict all of these things, and it becomes clear to us how this capacity to intuit concepts is an inherent part of understanding the world. We cannot understand the world without concepts. Otherwise, we can't sort of like predict, as you're saying, what's going to happen with the billiard ball next. And it's the same for all realms of life when you begin to generalize it out.
Yes, and I think that this can just to meditate on this this thought experiment. I think that one can get quite far as relates to metaphors, say, for the way life works. The problem is, of course, that with material science, predictability has become the goal, and observation's been thrown out the window. Oddly enough, right? Because if you think about the way in which cell biology,
you thinking about anything concrete there? Anything specific?
Cell biology. I'm thinking about the way cell biology works in silico, the way gene sequencing works. It's the way in which natural science generally kills what it. In order to study cells, we kill the cells, right? And so then we think we have what was living, but we don't, because we weren't observing what was living. And I'm not saying it's not useful. I'm not saying that it's I'm not saying it's not useful.
No,
I am saying
yeah.
I am saying that once you get away from the observation, then you get away from the phenomena. You no longer have the phenomena. You only have a model of the phenomena. And again, that's not even a problem, because as we looked at in Riddles of Philosophy, the provisional is a very important step in knowledge for us.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we get sort of combinatorial explosion and we just blow up. But at the same time, when the model is believed as the only way as reality, or the only way to capture reality, then the phenomena is opaque, which is what happens with thinking.
Fascinating, isn't it? Yeah.
Right?
And
so
I think
lovely.
we can draw a direct connection here too. Let's say we had all these concepts of angles, speed, momentum, elasticity, but we didn't have the concept of spin on a ball. Then there would be so many things that we could not explain that were happening on the pool table all the time. And we would have to slightly say, oh, well, that's... Would you just ignore that in all your results? Or would you sort of be intellectually honest and say, there's a concept missing here, guys, and we need to work out what it is. And like you're saying, it's like in a rigid science, in a material science where they think they've already nailed down all the concepts. So there's 100% belief in the model over the observed phenomena. That's where science runs into real problems. It's building. I think a topic we'll come back to is building castles in the air that are right.
Well, this is good. This is good. This is a good start here. I didn't expect to uncover this much here, but there are a lot of things that could be left out conceptually. You're right, and those conceptions are, say, laws discovered. So there's a metaphor for what's going on if there are laws to discover, say. That's a question. The other thing is that though we can make that metaphor, inorganic processes like this, for example, I'm not going to sort of say every inorganic process, but I would suggest every, has a finite field of selective possibilities, say. And if you have the right instrumentation, you can tease out every possible, right? Of course, you would have to program it into the instrumentation to do so. And I also, so I want to say that, complex nature doesn't have finitude associated with it as relates to all the possibilities. It just doesn't. So there's a problem right away. So if you're treating the universe like the billiard ball, then you're narrowing the scope of that which you're measuring, and then you might even not even know you're doing it, but you're changing the actual events that are occurring before you through observation. But it's not through observation; it's through instrumentation, and it can be instrumentation of the mind.
Yeah, it's a topic I'm sure we'll come back to. It's like more in depth, but I think it is also worth mentioning here. It's like really stressing this idea that most people think we see with our eyes. When you begin to dig deeper into it, you realize you see with your thinking. I think chapter 4, that's going to become like even more obvious to what sounds like a counterintuitive statement. I've mentioned this to like well-qualified people before, and they've struggled before. But then actually there were quite simplistic methods for helping them to understand that is the case with so-called like optical illusions and these type of things that fascinated us as kids. If you really begin to take them apart as adults in this context of we see with thinking and not with our eyes, then it somehow becomes more real. It becomes more substantial rather than it's like an empty concept.
Yeah, I think near-death experiences are an example of that. If you've ever known anybody, as opposed to just reading accounts, how detailed they describe conversations, and the operating room was my stepfather's experience, and he described in details from an outside vantage point what exactly was. He could see it, right, and he could tell you what the doctors were saying. He could see it and hear it. So clear vision and clear audio. What do you say?
Audience, yeah, I think it's clear audience. I think that's what.
Anyway, real clear hearing and real clear seeing.
Yeah,
happens with thinking. Yeah, and there's no question about that. It also is somewhat brain bound too, right? It's
okay. Since you brought up NDEs here, yesterday in the conversation, as at the end of the conversation. And this is also talked about in the chapter. Steiner says that once we come out of the activity of thinking and begin to observe it, not whilst it's happening, but afterwards using your memory, what you're doing is you're taking a position outside of thinking, and therefore you're able to observe it. And the imagery that you're using, that's very often come across with NDE people who've had NDE experiences, it's exactly that. I saw myself from outside my body, and often it takes them a while to realize that it's them or sorry, their bodies lying there. And then eventually they make the connection. And I think it's also a wonderful metaphor for what is the exceptional state? It's having an NDE experience with your thinking.
Oh, I think very literally. I think very literally. And I think this will in the future chapter where he talks about the physiology being replaced by thinking, when you're doing thinking, when you're really thinking, because then it is an after death experience, except that it's I mean, we're dying all the time inside to some extent. So anyway, yeah, I think that's powerful. It's not just a metaphor. I think the near-death experience, I think it's an example of the exceptional state that he's describing. And I think you nailed it when you said we see with our thinking. I was thinking the very same thing this morning on my drive home from taking the kids to school. Very, very much.
Just on that subject there, have you also noticed, because we've been engaging intensively in this study of philosophy of freedom, that the world is serving you up examples to exemplify what concept? Yesterday I talked about the sauna and conversations in the sauna at the group. It does. I'm experiencing it increasingly that I have these, like the Schelling question, or that we'll come to, and other things. I go, okay, I'm finding it difficult to, as you Americans say, grok this, to get it. And then all of a sudden is a little bit, sometimes it can be 15 minutes later. And sometimes it's a few days later, but it's like that question has continued to live on in me. And then when the world is give me an example. So there's that connection. Okay, this is an example of what you were trying to find a good concrete example for, Angus. And then you can use that perhaps as a means for describing to people what is initially what sounds like a very abstract, dead, boring, intellectual concept, but it's actually there all the time staring us in the face. But because we don't have the concepts, we don't have the thinking, we don't actually see it there. So I went on a little bit, but
no.
So my direct question, coming back to the direct question, are you also noticing a change? Because you mentioned on the drive on the way home with your daughter.
Am I noticing a change in the way I'm seeing the world? Sort of like we just got a Toyota truck, and I see Toyota trucks everywhere. I mean, yes. Although, I'm just so occupied with this kind of thinking almost all the time. People find it unbearable at a certain point because if I'm going to talk about something, this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So, but yes, what I've actually was noticing this morning, and I fully expected it, is how much noticing of things I didn't understand in readings before. How many of those things are not just seeing them new, but just seeing them anew with other people. And so I knew when I came here from dropping the kids off that we were going to be sharing these new clarities, say, and that they would probably be specifically the same ones, and they were. And we'll get to those, right? So in some cases.
Should we move on to the next slide? I'll just pop up. So that's I think we said more or less. One thing that we didn't say in relation to this was, because it is actually straight after the billiard balls that he mentions the exceptional state, but that ultimately it's of great significance. It's an important fact in the thinking life that you cannot observe it directly, but then thinking can become it can turn itself into, it can become something which can then become the subject of thinking itself. So it becomes a percept, something which then, and this, in this you've got this, I'm going to call it an infinity loop. It's like built in, because if you've created some content with your thinking, so like you go out for a walk, it's like when you come back from the walk, you review where your thinking went during that walk, and you make a new observation. So your thinking reveals, aha, there was something more behind this, or there was something new that came out during that thinking process. Then that in itself can form part of like new content which can be thought about. And in that sense, I mean an infinity loop, that it can, if you've got the mental energy and the interest to do it, you have this sensation of unendingness. I would like to call it, which I think corresponds well with this idea that thinking is it's a spiritual activity. It is endless. It is limitless. It is those characteristics that we often attribute to the divine. You can begin to get a sense of it in that process as you follow it, if you've done that a few times. Okay, so what was the next one? We're talking about God, Genesis. So he brings up the topic of Genesis, which feels very out of place in a philosophical work. Go on, tell us your take on this.
God. Let's see. Where to begin? At the beginning, I guess.
Good place.
So it's in this thought stream, say, that he's talking about, well, this isn't where he talks about consciousness. That's toward the end.
That's towards the end, yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
But it's the same.
It's
the same discussion, because he says in that description, people think we should, if we're examining thinking, that we should examine consciousness first. We should define what consciousness is, because that's where thinking occurs, in that place, so-called. Of course, we've done nothing to define consciousness as a human species. So in that case, he was referring, that was the geology reference as relates to where we need to start. But on the other hand, he says there, if I was a world creator, then I might lay out what consciousness is first, and then that would be the ground out of which I then created everything else, say, maybe. And so he's playing around with the idea of creation here, because he's not saying that we aren't world creators. And then this also relates to Schelling, right? Because Schelling says to what, think about nature is to create nature, or
to know nature is to create nature.
To know nature is to create nature. And he's not saying that's not true either, but he is saying that it's not true in the sense that Schelling meant it as a nature thinker.
Yeah.
He's saying that so I believe previous to this, he says that we are in the exceptional state, we are creating our own thinking. So we're in.
This is the bit where
Yeah.
he talks about, it's like billiard balls, thinking, observation, concept formation. Then he goes to the exceptional state, and then the very next bit, if I'm not mistaken, is he introduces this Genesis, this reference to Genesis, that even God, he had to create before he can contemplate.
Yeah. It was about activity. Like you can't be productive and be conscious of that productivity at the same time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I've noticed, I think I commented in one of your comments to the Lost Scrapbook, I commented about, I find his use of metaphors also like deeply, there's also something deeper going on here. So I was looking at it through this lens, and for me, what he is suggesting is that if you really get what the exceptional state is, the true nature of it, it's like passing through the eye of a needle. It's sort of like this. You're entering. I was saying a little bit similar. It's like before we started, wasn't I, with Aristotle and Plato? But it's this experience of a whole new realm of experience is being opened up. Steiner uses this phrase, it's the often unobserved activity of our souls. He's not saying it's never done, because he gives that simple example with, I can say I'm thinking about the table, which is also an exceptional state, but it's a lot rarer to really deepen inside this activity as opposed to the product of the activity. And I think already here he is hinting at the deeply spiritual nature of what is going on as you enter into the exceptional state, that you are made aware of this spiritual activity. Some people will hate the word spiritual here. I can think of a few people that I've talked with about this. They'd much prefer to use the word mental activity, but Steiner is insistent, no, this is spiritual activity, geistig. It's not mental, as it would be in German. And at the same time, if we pull the thread through this eye of the needle, then all of a sudden we're out into a new realm of existence, or not a new realm. It's like an added dimension which was always there, but which we've paid so little attention to. And that was the connection we were making with Plato and Aristotle, wasn't it? That Plato represented the idea, okay, so very simplistically, Plato is obviously far more complicated than the few simplistic sentences I'm about to give, but it was the world of ideas. You worked with I'm trying to think of the word. It's like you worked with axiomatic statements to arrive at truths. And what I even feel like axiomatic, I'm not getting the right word there, so you might be able to like help me here. But so Plato's flavor of thinking is then radically changed by Aristotle, who says, no, we've got to, rather than working with axiomatic statements, that we apply our thinking to the world around us, to the physical world. So this thinking that was like based on understanding these axiomatic statements and just like and truths, meta ideas, instead we apply this to what's going on in the world. And again, it's like hugely simplified. It's like much of Matt's channel is called Footnotes to Plato. And I understand why he says it, but you could almost equally call it footnotes to Aristotle, because a lot of like Western thinking has been shaped. The trouble is, of course, Plato was Aristotle's teacher, but we could, with some justification, call much of Western history footnotes to Aristotle. And what Steiner, I believe, is doing here with pinpointing this exceptional state is we have a whole new realm of existence that's waiting to be explored. And if once we begin to explore it, we will be entering into, because it's spiritual activity, we are already in the world of the gods and creative activity. And hence, for me, it's like this very strange appearance of Genesis in a book on philosophy becomes, perhaps this is what he was trying to achieve with that, trying to draw our attention to this little thing that I've called the exceptional state, Ausnahmezustand, is a big deal, actually.
Yeah, wow, that's rich. I really appreciate that, the way you breathed life into that that moment, and it was a precise moment too, I would say. And I've often contended, and I think this work is a testimony to it, that Steiner was unifying the Platonic and the Aristotelian, right? And it was definitely separate, and we still speak about it as if they're diametrically opposed, or that Aristotle made a break from Plato. But I have a feeling if the library wouldn't have burned, we would have seen the metamorphosis, not the polarity, right? And we would have seen that the consciousness was taking a step into the way the world comes into being. Consciousness was in Aristotle was experienced as that, and so he was like, wait, no, look out here, you can see what it is that people need to be able to see in their lives as they wake up in the day, and the world is about them, you know. And so, and then I think that that gives more, let's say, rather than axiomatic picturing that Plato was doing, it was more like the near-death experience description we were describing as exceptional state, that he was viewing the archetypal world coming into being, and then the whole Western project on Aristotle's efforts, say, in deeply involved efforts to understand the world that was and has and is coming into being. And that's what's happening here with thinking as the lever, the fulcrum and the lever. It's both the fulcrum and the lever.
Yeah.
And there'll be plenty to say about thinking later.
It's I do think it's nice to use like strengthen that picture of Aristotle and Plato there. I think it's when we were reading riddles of philosophy in the group, it's interesting how challenging it is to try to think your way back into how the Greeks like thought, or how they saw thoughts like we see things today. They were perceptions. Steiner describes it sort of like, just like, I don't doubt the existence of this mug. I don't need to talk about belief. It's there in front of me, and it's a direct perception. And that was the same for the Greeks. They could literally perceive. It wasn't, they hadn't created thoughts like we do in the strengthened ego. They accompanied objects at the same time. And at the same time, with this Plato Aristotle angle, you realize the deep significance of these two thinkers as streams in human thinking, and what's going on here could be interpreted as momentous as that, because a new realm of experience is being suggested as an area, and as an area for scientific investigation. It's still science, it's observation. It's like, okay, what does my thinking tell me about the observation? But rather than it being directed outwards, so like where I passively receive sensory information and then apply my thinking to it. No, here it's a study of the thinking process itself. Yeah, that experience is a deepening experience. Just to share one experience, and I hope it'd be nice if you had something similar as well to share, Jeff. But one of the things that I notice when I steep myself in that type of thinking is that all of a sudden, like reading the Upanishads becomes I recognize this. I've got the conceptual framework to read something that 20 years ago I'd have looked at it and just go, I have no idea. I have no idea. Literally every sentence I'd be going, what on earth are they talking about? But I'm no longer in that position because the conceptual life has matured. It's taken on new concepts, and I see life being breathed into those concepts when I read these people. And also this fascination that there were people 2, 3, 4,000 plus years ago who, in a different state of consciousness, were also recognizing similar truths to what I believe that I am slowly waking up to.
Yeah, I think part of the process is overcoming the speculative, the argumentative posture that, in a way, is so prevalent in our culture, and it kind of demands that, like the need to provide evidence, for example, without examining what evidence and proof actually is, which is another conversation again, probably, but. When you say this body of concepts allows me to see things I haven't seen before, people listening often might say to themselves, or conventional thinking will say, and it's public opinion, it's dominant in its persuasiveness, that well, you've just created a simulated reality, and you're confirming your biases, and that's all there is to that. There's not that if you have a you're just firming up your belief system, and all we really have is beliefs or feelings or whatever. But the actual when Steiner says they don't know what thinking is because they simply haven't examined thinking. And people say, why are you thinking about thinking? What sort of philosophizing
is there anything
thin air is that?
Yeah.
And that's sort of born of an anti-intellectual culture as well. But what I'm noticing here again is that he is this whole work is without metaphors and heuristics, and he takes you to a certain place, and then there's a hint, like this could open up as the way to understand everything else. Not saying it is,
That's
but I'm
right.
saying it's certainly more plausible than the models that we use that are abstracting us further and further away from the observational intimacy with complex systems in life, because we think, well, you can't understand that because it's complex. No, you abstract your understanding into complicated configurations in order to find some surety there, and then you call that complex, but it's not complex. What's complex is you, and you can only know the complex with the complex, I would suggest. And that's not speculation. It's not metaphor. It's not arguments, and it's not evidence.
Really, sorry.
And I also just wanted to make clear that when we were talking about near-death experience, I wasn't bringing that up as evidentiary. I was bringing up as a picture of the way in which everybody can access a kind of seeing that is at least one aspect of thinking, is this that we can't see without thinking. I mean, we know that even from course materialism, that we don't just see the world as through a camera, through a mechanical device. We see with that which we bring to the table.
You in your little bit there, I think you brought up a very important point that I was reflecting on. I think it was Max Leif. He posted something on Facebook about GPT, which I thought was really interesting. And as a counter to these people who are full of self-doubt, because one of the things that we've been encouraged to do is to like deepen a region of our soul to create a foundation on which to stand on, so like self-sufficiently, if I could put it like that. And in this article that Max had posted, he was citing somebody who had done some type of investigation, looked for some evidence of something with ChatGPT, and they had then asked for the supporting material for the arguments that were made in the idea in ChatGPT. It wasn't specific about what the actual question was, which is why I'm beginning to sound a little bit flaky. But so a statement was made, and then the follow-up question: okay, what's the material you're basing that on? What investigative research are you basing these conclusions on? And then ChatGPT served up some references, and then references were given which turned out to be references that ChatGPT had created itself. So what's that telling us? So like, this is an extreme situation of, I mean, what on earth can I believe in life? Okay, this is an extreme situation with ChatGPT, but if the world is moving in that direction where your so-called source of intelligence is making up information to justify the conclusions that it arrives at, where am I in all this? And this is also where the exceptional state, this deepened region of the soul, becomes even more critical, because as you lose your anchoring in the real world, because all of these fictions are being invented left, right, and center, if you don't have a center that's going to hold, where on earth are you going to be? And it struck me whilst I was reading that you with this, I think that the sign for I is like this, and it's a beautiful, it's just like very assertive. It's like to feel centered in yourself. And this ChatGPT moment when I was reading about it was, I mean, if you haven't got this, then where on earth can you feel any sense of certainty? So yeah, so just a reflection on what you were saying there.
No, that's a great addition to what I was trying to get at, and I think that's an excellent example, and it's also why this work, of all works of uh, of the philosophical tradition, but also works of art, I would say, of all works to engage with at this time, in order to engage that part of you that could not possibly be fooled by computationally algorithmically derived bits of information to look like the flow of thinking. If you already know what thinking looks like, you'll know that's not thinking, right? And so as the chapter goes on and as the book goes on, knowledge as relates to freedom is central. Now that's a bit of a mystery in this chapter, but he opens the door for that. Like if what's the relationship? This is actually a chapter more about knowledge than it is about freedom, right?
Yeah.
The freedom is implied in that we are generating our own thinking, not that we're just generating our own thoughts, but that we're generating our own thinking. And if you have to believe for certainty that your thinking is coming from your brain, you're not going to be able to access it. And this is the thing that Jonathan brought as a question is I think it was Jonathan, but the question was no, it was Kate on volley. Is materialism? Maybe it wasn't. I don't remember who it was. I'm sorry, I might be misrepresenting. But the point is that materialism as a mindset won't allow for access to this exceptional state. And it's only in the exceptional state that you're going to be able to discern from the sophisticated and complicated nature of the thinking technology. And there are other problems with there are other points of view in the world that preclude the exceptional state, but not as absolutely as materialism, right?
Yeah.
So if you think the brain is thinking, then you're going to get what it is this is going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's not going to be your brain. It's going to be a brain that is so computationally complex or complicated that it takes the information from every single source in the world that can provide data, and it'll be asynchronistically used to convince you of what it is it's trying to convince you of.
Yeah. I think this is a nice segue into the next slide, which is Descartes, because he brings in Descartes and talks about this famous I am statement, what's going on there. And this, if we go from my reading, and then we'd also talked a little bit earlier about how this can be misleading for certain people with certain educational backgrounds, for example. But what Steiner is doing, he's saying that Descartes, like in his sentence, I think, therefore I am, more specifically, I think, therefore, Descartes is recognizing it's like an absolute foundation. It's like an unequivocal experience of I exist. So that the whole sentence is like I doubt, therefore I think I am. But because this activity has all come from within myself, I can be certain of my own existence. I mean, I might sort of like doubt the existence of like my sensory impressions and everything else that's mediated to me like through my body. But my own experience of thinking is that it is my own production. And this is what Steiner says is like the essence of the importance of Descartes. And I think in my mind, I was like thinking, I'm surprised he didn't perhaps use someone like Fichte in there to describe this state, because Fichte was also somebody who based like the absolute self-conscious existence here. But I suppose the connection is actually obvious. We are talking about thinking. What is thinking in this chapter? And Descartes, I mean, if there's one sentence from philosophy that anybody who hasn't studied philosophy is likely to know, it's probably this sentence: I think, therefore I am. But he really wants to emphasize that what Descartes is recognizing in this is, I have found I think he calls it a corner, a piece of the world, a piece of world existence from which it's like everything else might grow. I think if you were using Christian imagery, I'm not building my castle on sand. I'm building it on a rock, and I think he's using Descartes to exemplify that. What about yourself? What was your takeaway? What might you like to add to that? Or
well, I think by this point he's established that we can't disregard thinking as subjective. Now, it might be, but there's no reason to draw that conclusion at this point if you're following the text rather than some sort of educational training that you've had as relates to what is subjective and what is objective. I believe by this point he's established that those are concepts that thinking makes so. And it doesn't mean that subjectivity doesn't exist or objectivity doesn't exist. It just means that they're not absolutes, and thinking is neither or both, depending on how you look at it, I suppose. Mm-hmm. But he's also saying here that the only thing that you can really take out of what Descartes himself meant, and people take all sorts of stuff out of it, and he himself took, I would say, a diminished thought structure from the intuition that he had. It mm-hmm. was a sort of eureka moment in a certain sense. But the simplest thing that you can say about something is that it exists. And I can say I exist by virtue of thinking. And so I think also here that the I is the thing that also is the thread that runs through this chapter. And if we pull in the previous chapter, he refers to the I as living in the spiritual world, but also living in non-spiritual reality. So we were talking about the word spiritual, which is, I guess, self-determining, right? Mm-hmm. It's something that's not dependent on its existence for anything else other than itself. That's one way.
Spinoza's free necessity, isn't it?
What's that? Free necessity, yeah. And so he's also using Descartes to spring off into, okay, so we've established this is what thinking is, and that I exist within thinking, which is how I'm sure that I create thinking, mm-hmm. right? And that I exist by virtue of that thinking. So can I then know the world with
that's another question.
With this thinking? Can I know the world in the way that I know my thinking? And that would suggest there's something of the world, although it's just a suggestion and a hint, hint's not the right word. It is not yet established, but it's certainly plausible. Again, more plausible than the materialistic epistemology we're saddled with. It's certainly plausible that the world is made out of something that is the self-same process that thinking is for us.
And also that it's thinking that's helped us to understand this world. So we're obviously going to use thinking to understand thinking. I remember reading a book by a guy called Ravelli, who's like he's a bit of a hit into like the quantum mechanics world. And I remember reading this absurd statement, which was along the lines of, well, you can't use thinking to think about thinking. And it was like, oh yeah, what are you going to use instead then? And this is a highly respected thinker coming out with absolute. I mean, when you really actually listen to the words and take the part, you think, how did he ever let that thought pass through? It's like his mouth pass from. It's like got invented up here and passed out to here without the filter of actually thinking about what he was saying. Because we can only know something by thinking about it. We can experience things with other faculties of the soul, with feeling and that type of thing. That's a different story. But if it's about knowing something, then it is through thinking. So he really he really makes clear that, yep, we're going to be consistent here. Just like we've used thinking to understand this world, we're going to use thinking to understand what thinking itself is.
Yeah,
and
we are
because
very,
it's the same nature. So go on.
yeah, I was going to say we're very rude guests in our own frame, in our own house, so to speak. If we disregard our host, my goodness, imagine you invited me over there, and I flew over and I came through the front door and I just completely disregarded you the whole time that we were together. I just was, we found your TV remote, or read all your books, ate all your food, and left. Right? I didn't even notice you were there. Right? There's no interest in the host. Why wouldn't you be interested in the host? Just at least entertain them. They might be subjective and foolish,
Yeah.
but get to know them and see what you find, because it's a deeply personal. It's a deeply obviously it's a deeply personal host that's hooked up with your very individual self. So and I would also say, less jokingly, that that thinking well, akin to that, why would we assume that this very obviously important part of our existence is somehow abstracted from nature, some sort of byproduct? But it's kind of self-loathing, really, that in kind of suicidal in a certain sense. Yeah. That I had another part of that.
It's nice, strong imagery that you're using there, but I feel myself agreeing with you a lot. We know things through thinking, and then if we undermine that by which we know, we're not dismissing healthy doubt here, but doubting thinking itself as an activity. That's a sick spirit, isn't it? Because it is through thinking that you know yourself and you know the world. And if you doubt that is even real, and I suppose you're one of these transcendental illusionists who's like believe that life's a dream, and there's no point to it. There's no reason behind anything.
It's also rather presumptive, but the presumptions aren't even noticed. So it's because it's fun. This is really fun, because this is where the rubber meets the road, kind of, right? Because in order to make presumptions, you have to use thinking, right? And then what are you basing your life on? Presumptions? Do you think being presumptive is the proper way to go through life? Like, just give it a shot, man. Just observe your thinking, and then tell me that when you've observed your thinking and you come back, tell me that it is a byproduct of something. And boy, he nails that with in a very quiet way when he talks about brain physiology. I don't know if I'm jumping ahead on your slides, but when he's talking about brain physiology, he says, um, um, for those who think that the brain
like Cabanis, he mentions Cabanis, doesn't he?
Yes, right. That like the digestion excretes, the brain excretes thoughts. Well, how do you pull together? So you've got a lot of concepts, say even what the brain is. How do you make the connections? How do you choose the concepts that you're going to use to create a picture of what you think the brain is? What process is going on that selects for all of the potential concepts, and then you decide these are the kind of right ones I'm going to use to hone in on what the brain is? Because it could be, it could be 12 different points of view about what the brain is. It could be a biophysiological one. It could be a psychological process. Could be from a cognitive science standpoint and psychometrics and that sort of thing, right? But none of those are a description of thinking. They're just a description of some artifacts of thinking, and then you call thinking itself an artifact. It's an amazing presumption.
It is. In actuality, that's also a nice segue into the next slide. This is a little bit random, and I've got no idea how it's going to go. We might. I'll take full responsibility. I might hash this up horribly, but what I did whilst I was looking for the quote from Descartes, I saw these. I don't know if you can read them, but I saw these quotes by supposedly smart people on thinking. So I thought we'd have a little go at sort of like seeing to what extent we think they're smart and to what extent they sort of like they need to do a little bit more thinking. And I'm going to start with the bottom left here. I'll just read it out because in case it's not clear on the screen, but you and I can reflect on agree or disagree. So this is Tyson Deshimaru. I guess he's some Asiatic master or something like that. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am. I say, I do not think. That is why I exist." How would you respond to this wise person?
Oh, how do you know?
Exactly. You have to think about that to make that.
What do you mean by exist? What do you mean by I? What do you mean by do? What do you mean by not? What do you mean by think? What do you mean by that and is and my and all of the other words that you use? And who is Descartes? How do you know he said, "I think, therefore I am"? What in what context did you derive that? Because you saw it on the internet? Because you saw somebody quote it, right? Or what? I mean, where did you borrow those concepts if you're not thinking? And you probably did.
If you don't think, that's a pretty sorry existence you got. I mean,
well, and I think if you don't think, then somebody's thinking for you, and you don't know the nature of thinking itself.
Yeah, which actually, the interesting point you pick up on there, because I think this is also one of the big problem areas with this whole book, and when talking about this subject, what do we actually mean by thinking? And I don't want to pick it apart now. It's going to come up, although it was treated in this chapter, but I think we'd almost need to we'd want to prepare something else for that. But this word thinking is hugely problematic because it can mean so many different things, but actually Steiner is developing it as a technical term. And I suppose one way we could say is to be a bit nicer to this Tyson guy. He might be talking about a certain type of thinking that, it might be better to be without. Who knows? It's difficult. Okay, let's
No, I was a little harsh, but I do believe that there's something to what's being said here. You can't if what is called conventional thinking is used to determine your own existence, say, you're not going to get there because the ready-made claptrap of associated concepts that no longer have any thinking in them define the world for you as thinking as being completely subjective and abstracted away from reality and that sort of thing. And and you got to clear the decks for sure. I mean, I think that's a really important point. But if you don't think, you won't exist very long.
You won't exist, and you won't understand your existence
Either
either.
you will need to be provided for 100%, like a baby.
Yeah.
And then you're allowed to spout your wisdom without any observation as relates to the complexity of the world around you as it's evolving.
But you will have a fan club of babies.
Or people who look like babies.
Yeah. Okay, next one. This is Nat Hang. He says, I think, therefore, I am not here. That's a bit more profound. I think that for me, so initial reaction is, yeah, we really are sort of like, or have the possibility to be somewhere else in our thinking.
You could also say, I think, therefore, I am everywhere.
Yeah, that's
which what I would admit is rare for me. I spend a lot of my time reacting to the world. My discipline isn't as great as it could be, but if what Steiner is implying about thinking is a reality, or is a, let's say, a reality, then thinking is universal. So you're not you're a both an individual thinking, and you're participating in for lack of a better word, creation. So not only am I not here, I am here, but I'm also
fully present.
Right. Otherwise, it's a Hegelian kind of thing, right? Of where the soul itself is dissipated into thin air, and there's no incarnating into anything, because you're just gone off into a spiritual state of consciousness without a body. And I think that's, for me, that's the reverse of the process that we want to achieve, in my opinion, because I love the idea, and I love life. So why would I want to not be here?
Yeah. My thinking whilst you're talking about that is being encouraged into the direction of, it's like why Averroes was a heretic, or why the Christian thinking had to eradicate it, because Averroes, he was of the idea that's like when we die, we all dissolve just back into the spiritual world, whereas the Christian idea is that we retain our individuality. It's like also when we die, and this was why it was heretical there. And in the words that you were using then, it's like made me think that this desire to disappear out of existence is if you don't want to think, I think, therefore, I am not here. Tricky. Let's move on to the next one. I think, therefore, I am confused. 100% agree with the guy. but at the same time, I become less confused if I think about things.
Well, I agree that he's confused.
Do you know who he is?
I don't, but I agree that he's confused about thinking, because if his statement is absolute, then he's clear that he's confused.
You could accuse him of being honest as well.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. in a way, in a more sinister way, I think.
Okay, a long time ago, Descartes said, I think that's supposed to say, said, I think, therefore I am. But if you are not thinking, what? Huh.
It's a good question.
Then you're at mercy of those who think for you. Possibly. Okay. Next one. Jacques Lacan. I think where I am not, therefore I am where I do not think. I am not whenever I am the plaything of my thought. I think of what I am where I do not think to think. Okay, no, so I can't make anything of that. Do you think he's deliberately trying to confuse us?
Well, I mean, isn't that what postmodernism is? It's what do they call that? Word salad.
Yeah.
You know, tossed salad.
Yeah.
I was going to go lewd there, but I'm not going to do that.
If you're thinking about word salads and a person, I'm thinking about word salads and people as well, but we won't go there. Yeah.
I was thinking about tossed salad, but that's a very, very, very interesting jail term. Go ahead. But that's what I think of. When I think of postmodernism, I think of when I think of postmodernism in this use of language in order to obscure ignorance, the lack of humility is profound.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? So for some reason, and perhaps if I think about it at some time in the future, it might become clear why, but I'm connecting it to magicians. Magicians, for me, there's always something a little bit nefarious about them. I mean, their job is to deceive people. They learn certain tricks that are based on understanding our psychology and sort of like manipulating that so that they can get us to believe something that seems impossible. Sleight of hand, distraction, this type of thing. And I experience that as somehow similar when I read this type of thing. It seems like they're trying to be smart, but am I stupid? I don't understand them, or really are they just saying stupid things? Perhaps that's my first initial reaction.
From just a personal opinion point of view, complex reality understood sounds simple, which is why we can sort of look, when we hear it, it can sort of be brushed aside. But complicated perception of reality always comes out like shattered glass of untraceable surface. So the complicated looks significant and deep, but it's all just fractionated bits and jagged edges on the surface of they say the well of life. Isn't that what they deep wells? What do they say? Still waters run deep.
Yeah, and you've just helped me remind of something that fascinates me about the thinking life that I don't think we've talked about before, but it's something that I've thought about a lot, that deeply fascinates me, and it's about the learning process. And this is something that everybody who's ever learned something will recognize. Why is it that, let's say let's say we've battled with calculus, but it can be any concept. It doesn't matter. Let's just say calculus for example here. So I beat my head against the wall and I find it difficult, 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 difficult. And I keep training difficult, difficult, difficult. One day, the penny drops. And now I can't remember why it was so difficult. I know that it was difficult, but what is it? What is it about my thinking? What happens in all of our thinking where all of a sudden we can't understand why we couldn't understand? I know this is perhaps this is word salad as well. I don't know, but I find it deeply fascinating that this is an essential part of our experience. Not understanding things, and then suddenly it's like a new insight coming, and we just go, "Why didn't I see that before? Why did I struggle?" It's
a difference between thinking and not thinking, and we were talking about this before we started recording. Basically, the reason why so we've described before that philosophy of freedom is a work that has a living quality to it, and when you come back to it, you, for many reasons, the reasons we've discussed and probably more, you see things you never saw before, like a great work of art always provides. And in this case, it's so direct. The language is rather simple, and it's not jargonistic like Lacan and the tricksters that the postmodernists are. So we have this. What was I going to say? We are. Oh, I've lost it.
Lacan, tricksters. We are. The work, the philosophy of freedom,
the understandings
something that we come back to time and time
ever
again.
revealing themselves in a certain sense because they work on so many different levels, say, or for whatever another description would be, but that the reason that I've discovered, I think this time, is that, for me at least, is that I go through sort of an affirmation bias, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I in other words, I stop thinking. And what all of those quotes have in common is that they stopped thinking at the point at which they addressed thinking. And this, since this work is so inside of the phenomena of thinking, and we're starting to understand the complexity of thinking itself, and we don't even know where it's coming from yet. We haven't dealt with the origin of thinking, yet there are certainly indications here that a science of cognition is possible coming out of a true phenomenology, not an instrumentalist phenomenology. But what I realized myself is that when I come up against something like the geology quote about or the Genesis quote, or any of these things.
Oh, would you like the Schelling quote, seeing as he's the next slide,
and the Schelling quote, and all of these things, right? That I stopped thinking because I'd already achieved something of what the spirit of this work is, and I was a little bit self-satisfied, perhaps, or not rigorous enough, or all of these things, and I that seems pretty clear to me now. Like this is some sort of and I call it affirmation bias because it's not necessarily that sort of subconscious confirmation bias that people usually talk about, but it's that I've actually found something, and I'm looking for a mirror of it, and I only saw the mirror. So it's a very narcissistic kind of not in the Donald Trump sense of narcissistic, but narcissistic in the myth sense that I'm just looking at the reflection, and I'm like, yes, okay, well that affirms that, and I can move on.
Can I tie that back to billiards, all the way back to the beginning when we were talking about we find satisfaction in understanding certain aspects. And there is this little bit of a alleluia moment, eureka moment. I am somewhat smarter because I've seen through it. But what we don't realize is that there are levels of subtlety that we've failed to. Do you know what I mean? We have to live with this content, and then suddenly a word will stick out. And I'm going to give an example of this in a second with Schelling. A word will stick out and we'll go, why did he put that word there? Because this sort of like, just by putting that word there, so like something different happens. And this bit on Schelling, it's the bit where he says to know nature is to create nature. And it's actually really, really interesting. So like this small detail, and I'll just read it for clarity's sake here. So Schelling says to know nature is to create nature. Anyone who takes these words of the bold nature philosopher literally must renounce forever all knowledge of nature. And I've never read that word literally as important. But when you dig into that, and you dig into Schelling, and you realize that Schelling in many ways, he was really trying to resolve this idealism realism conflict. This sentence, nature is visible spirit and spirit is visible nature. It is this is sort of like the essence of his soul, and in that sense he's fully aligned with someone like Goethe and Schiller, the people of his age. And Matt has done a couple of really good videos on Schelling on his channel. And so then I begin to think, okay, first of all, I have to go back to know what does Steiner mean, or what does Schelling mean by to know nature is to create nature. Okay, first of all, you have to understand that, which I've been lazy about before. So I pick it apart, I learn, I see this word literally, and I think, what on earth is going on? And then once I've got a level of clarity over that, then all of a sudden the next sentences by Steiner, which I'm about to read, it becomes abundantly obvious how Schelling appears to be being used as like a dummy that said something stupid. But the reality is, if you dig into Schelling, that Schelling was, he didn't have the clarity of thought specifically about thinking that Steiner had, but in many senses, he has the same profound insights about nature's process and thinking being the latest step in the evolution of nature. Because after he talked about Schelling here a little bit, and to know nature is to know nature is to create nature, and he dismisses it, saying this can't be true because you have to know things before you can make them. Just like you can't make a computer if you don't know how to make a computer. You have to know it first and then you can make it. But then Steiner goes on to say, what is impossible with nature, creating before cognition, we achieve in thinking. And then all of a sudden, bang, something that I've missed time and time and time again in my reading. I've understood at a far deeper level why Schelling is being brought into there, because I had been misreading Schelling, but I had to inform myself about Schelling to understand why Steiner used this little word literally to say this might be how the average idiot, which Angus was, would understand it, but this isn't what he meant. He meant something far more subtle, and in actual fact, this is the perfect descriptor of how thinking is unique in nature. It creates before it knows. And all of this it's unpacked itself in my mind, despite having read this book 10 plus times.
Right. Well, that goes back. That quote goes back to Genesis, the Genesis quote too, right? And it's also pulling in that imagery of being rude. It's rather rude to Steiner to think that he didn't enter the thinking, well, it's not necessarily rude. It's an accusation that you would need to make, that he didn't enter the thinking of the thinkers that he's providing for. And what they did was that they were really good at thinking. Now we're just extolling the virtues and the reality and the virtuating reality of thinking, say, and so we damn well better enter other people's thinking if we want to extend our own thinking, even, say. And this is something we talked about with Riddles of Philosophy. What he does amazingly is he puts you right inside their psycho-spiritual organization, and it was and the group started behaving like the consciousness of that era, as it was being expressed in a way, and so he's really inhabiting Schelling in the way that where the sort of the money in the mouth way, because his implied contention here is that thinking is a universal process, and it's universal to nature, and that thinking is not separate from nature, and we create nature inside our thinking. And again, this is another one of those where a nature philosopher's prejudice is the boundary at which his thinking stops and the prejudice expresses itself. That we create nature is a it's not necessarily a ridiculous claim, but it's not a supported claim. So again, he doesn't say it, but to me this implies, and I mentioned this at the end of the previous group, in a certain sense, that he's solving the collective intelligence, individual intelligence problem, and it's not distributed cognition through media, whatever various media you might describe. It is an actual field of consciousness that is both individual and universal. That's what I take from this as well, that we are participating in creation, but we have to do it where we are. We can't do it where we presume it finishes, because the speculation itself then blocks you from actually participating in the way that we need to participate. And rightly so, I think Owen Barfield was evoked out of this chapter in our book.
It also makes me think about what we were talking about in our last session, the human and cosmic thought, the importance of being able to move around the spectrum of thinking, because this is what he is also forcing you to do in this this diametrically opposite way. He's saying what is untrue for nature is true for thinking, and it's showing that's like a truth is not a truth. That a truth is not a truth. That's a stupid sentence, I guess. A truth depends on the perspective from which you're looking from, and that's also something I think we struggle with our thinking. I know we talked a little bit about it with Jonathan last week. One final thing on Schelling, which I thought was interesting, that came up very clearly when I was reading around him, is he was really trying to reconcile the Fichtean individual solipsistic. Thank you. Solipsistic state of soul with Spinozan free necessities, like God consciousness. It's like down at an individual level, and I found like that description. I know Matt's talked about how he's particularly liked Schelling, and I've gained a new respect for him by deepening myself in like some of his thinking there, and that also makes me realize when I read a book like this or the Riddles of Philosophy that there is so much more behind what Steiner has written on the page there. Do you know what I mean? As you were hinting at, it's like Steiner, he's entered into their worldviews. He's seen the world through their eyes, and with hardly inserting himself in the conversation, he's representing to us their thought, so that we have to battle our way through. It's like, to what extent, what truth value does it have? To what does it tell me about the world around us?
You know, going forward, we're going to be needing to define thinking more more comprehensively. Let's say, I think that's the right word. And this is a clue, and I like clues because I have my own boundaries, and I want those. I want that perspective broadened out so that I can encompass more. But the empathy is what you're describing, to look through somebody else's eyes. That's such an overused word nowadays, right? Empathy. And it's usually synonymous. People mean it with a sort of emotional sympathy, which really devolves into pity, and then condescendingly, you know that how you might help people, for example. But to really see from another person's point of view, and I don't mean intellectual point of view, but I don't mean not intellectual point of view, but empathically, that is literally not involuntarily drawn to, but enjoined with. And if thinking is a universal process, that's not only very possible, it's probably happening in ways that we're not aware, just as we're not aware of thinking itself. And so does thinking affect the world? Well, we'll find out. Can thinking be used to know the world? We'll find out. But one thing for sure is that's being clearly demonstrated is Steiner's ability at empathy, which is thinking, feeling, and willing all wrapped up in one, right? And it takes the discipline of the will in thinking to train it so that you can in a continuous flow self-engender the thinking that enters the real feeling life of other thinkers, and in the way in which their life is informed through their whole soul process. Thinking is not, I mean, this is, in our conversation, thinking can seem like we're just talking about the intellectual conceptualization, say, but it's so much more than that, and it's
an unmapped territory. It's very vague as to what's actually going on there, I think.
And it turns that which is merely personal, as relates to this subjectivity, say, the merely personal into something universal. And we've intimated that before, but this is particularly intimate notion right now for me because of what Steiner's able to do lovingly with the thinkers that he's approaching. So he lovingly treats Spinoza. He's not treating these people as punching bags.
Yeah. I think that we'll have to put that on the to-do list. An important to-do list. It's like really try to have a conversation just about what is thinking, what is not thinking, or like mapping out the territory somehow. It's like recognizing that we use the word thinking as a catch-all expression when perhaps we're referring to very different aspects of, like, in the thinking spectrum. It's just like all light is electromagnetic activity. Well, yeah, that is true, but so, like, it does remove some subtleties.
Or all water is oxygen and hydrogen,
Yeah.
right? So therefore, rivers are just oxygen and hydrogen.
Yeah.
With creatures that are biochemically made,
Bit
that
of
sort of thing. It's absurd.
carbon.
It's
Yeah.
just absurd. It is the Munchausian pigtail trick, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
What we call knowledge today.
Okay, let's move on. I think we're just like briefly this Archimedes slide. I think I'm beginning to like interpret it as the same as the Genesis and the eye of the needle. So like he's again emphasizing this point that we really are getting at a part of our soul that if we, like when Archimedes like understood the principle of levables, like theoretically it became possible to move the world. I think he's trying to hint to us that this is profound, what we're talking about here, what the world that opens up to us once we begin to enter more deeply and more regularly into the exceptional state. So unless you, had you thought about anything else? Because we've got one slide after this, which is the geology one, which I think is going to be an interesting slide.
Just that it's the closest thing to a claim that he makes as relates to thinking in service of knowledge as that which could get underneath the very structure of the world and explain it. Yeah. I mean, that's a small claim.
Perhaps, I mean, I think it's half a page or a page later, he then makes this geology analogy, which I think is hugely powerful. Do you want to talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, I think it's associated with he also says that in the evolution where the last thinking is the last link. I don't know if he says we are the last link or thinking is the last link.
It's the last step in the evolution of nature, isn't it? It's something along those lines.
The very latest.
Yeah, the most recent. That's the key link. It's the most recent. Just like, so he says something when he's referring to geology. He says that geology was sort of like couldn't make good sense of the world as long as it's believed in cataclysms as the explanation for everything that we saw in the geological strata. He says that once geology started working back from what it knows, then it created a firm foundation on which to base the rest of the science.
Yeah, right. So now he's laying out a methodology, right?
Yeah.
So he feels like he's established that thinking provides the way in, say, to the inner workings of, again, for lack of a better word, creation. I know the connotations are religious there. That which is emergent, say, but so, and then being able to negotiate and explain it. And the methodology is to start with that which we most intimately know and work through that, which is the thing that gives us leverage back into the origins of existence, say. Right. And so, yeah. So I leave that there for a minute because I think I'd rather hear this.
I'm looking for the quote because I thought it was also very powerful when he starts talking about scientific models, atoms, and stuff. Where is it? So I'll read a couple of sentences so that we find our way there. So an important idea is we cannot deny that before anything else can be understood, thinking must be understood. And he uses this Schelling idea that not in the book, but it's part of Steiner, that thinking is the latest evolution of nature. It's the most recent upgrade, if we could call it that. It's evolution is a perfectly adequate word. And that if we want to understand nature, that's where we focus our attention on this thinking faculty. And then he makes the point about geology, and then somewhere he starts talking about how I'm looking for atoms and things, because that's what he's talking about. Okay, things I can't find the quote. I'll have to go from what's in memory. But he's saying that science and our understanding of the world will be floating in the air until it understands the foundation on which it stands. So atoms, electromagnetism, quantum theory, all of these things are products of thinking. And if we don't understand thinking itself, all of those concepts have no foundation on which to stand. Or they are standing on an unknown foundation, is better to say.
Right, that because that's really important, and as relates to thinking being the last thing, because I want to go back to that, but they will not be useful in the service of knowledge, which is what the chapter title is: thinking in service of knowledge. Thinking is the thing that has to be intimately tied up with knowledge, and including understanding, having a knowledge of what thinking is. The other thing about this statement is that it's the last, is that in the evolution, in Darwinian, profound Darwinian evolutionary picture, that which is the last is that which is novel. That but it's not novel in the sense of novelty. It's novel in the sense of the latest emergence of basically what Craig Holridge of Nature Institute here in America describes as the evolutionary materialistic evolutionary biology's presumption that there is a creative that there is intelligent design.
It's a teleology.
Right? It is a teleology, but it's not recognized by evolutionary biology. They throw that out, but because they don't recognize their own thinking, they don't see how they've constructed these models that are believed rather than are intentionally derived heuristics, say. And we've talked about that before. But the beautiful thing about this is that just like a baby is the latest version that is born right now, is the latest version of humanity. It is rooted in the most ancient version of humanity, or the most ancient reality. So the newest is the oldest, because it's the next extension beyond where we are. And that's not just mind tricks. That's not a Lacan tricksterism. Because if you meditate on that, then the continuity of what it is to be a human being, and the continuity of what it has been to be an individual through lifetimes, say. Now, he hasn't established that yet either, but I do contend that it's as in seed form, it's possible to derive a science of that process through coupling these two things: the evolutionary picture, that which is the latest, and thinking itself that is a transparent picturing of the way in which that evolution has occurred through time, and then participating in that.
Okay. Coming back to the teleology thing, this was also an idea that Schelling developed some quite sophisticated thinking around, and one of the ideas that that he espouses is the idea that teleology is an aesthetic. You cannot prove it in a natural science from a natural science perspective. It's a little bit like the problems that someone like Popper has with evolutionary biology. It has no predictive value. So you can't it can't be called it can't be called a scientific theory, and teleology also falls into that problem area. It becomes an artistic interpretation of nature, but one that is adequate for describing what's going on. I think I've minced that up somewhat horribly, but I think there's something to this teleology argument which is very interesting, which I'm not my thinking is not sophisticated enough to express clearly. Well, but I did find the specific quote. It was at the bottom of page 44. He says, as long as philosophy assumes all kinds of principles such as atoms, movement, matter, will, and the unconscious, your favorite word, it will hover in the air. Only when the philosopher regards the absolutely last thing as the first, like in geology, can the goal be reached. But this absolute last thing achieved by world evolution is thinking. There's your geology, the geology of the mind.
Geology of existence. Yeah. Beautiful.
Jeff, great conversation. Let's press stop here.
All right.